Have you ever felt that creeping unease, that prickling on the back of your neck that tells you something is deeply wrong? It's a feeling I know intimately now, a constant companion that settled in my bones the week my neighbor, Charles, borrowed my shovel. It started, innocently enough, 5 years ago. 5 years. It feels like a lifetime, and in a way, for Charles and his wife, Kathy, it probably is. That was when their world fractured, the day their son, Michael, vanished. 14 years old. Just a kid. I remember the day Charles told us, my wife and I. He stood on our porch, his face ashen, the morning sun casting stark shadows under his eyes, making him look older than his 51 years. His voice was hollow, almost a whisper, as he choked out the words, "Michael, he's gone. Gone." Such a small word for such a monumental loss. We stood there, my wife, Sarah, clutching my arm, both of us speechless, absorbing the shockwaves of his quiet devastation. Charles, our neighbor, the man who waved cheerfully across the lawn, who occasionally shared a beer and sports talk, was suddenly adrift in a nightmare. The police were involved, of course. The news vans descended on our quiet street, turning our normally peaceful cul-de-sac into a stage for tragedy. Michael's face, a shy, freckled kid with a mop of brown hair, was plastered on every news channel, every missing person flyer stapled to telephone poles and grocery store bulletin boards. Missing, Michael Davies, age 14. Last seen. The details blurred into a horrifying montage of flashing lights, tearful interviews with Kathy, and Charles's stoic, yet crumbling facade. Sarah and I, we felt helpless. Utterly, devastatingly helpless. We baked casseroles, offered to walk their dog, anything, everything to ease their burden, to show them they weren't alone in this agonizing void. But grief, I learned, is a solitary journey. It builds walls, invisible and impenetrable, around the heart. The weeks bled into months, the months into years. The frantic search faded, the news vans packed up and left. The flyers became weathered and torn, then vanished altogether. Life, in its cruel, relentless way, moved on. For everyone it seemed, except Charles and Kathy. We assumed, as the years drifted by without a whisper of news, that they had come to terms with the unthinkable, that they had somehow, impossibly, learned to live with the crushing weight of uncertainty, the agonizing ambiguity of not knowing. We never dared to ask the question that burned on the tip of our tongues. Had they ever found a body? It felt too intrusive, too brutal, to voice the very thing we all secretly feared. Occasionally, Charles and Kathy, in a strained attempt at normalcy, would invite us over for summer barbecues. It was always during the warmer months, a pale imitation of happier times. The smell of charcoal and grilling meat hung heavy in the air, a scent usually associated with laughter and lightness, now tinged with a somber undertone. We'd sit in their backyard, the same backyard where Michael had probably played, and try to make polite conversation, the unspoken absence looming between us like a physical presence. Kathy, once vibrant and talkative, became withdrawn, a ghost of her former self. Her smiles were fragile, fleeting, never quite reaching her eyes. She was always quieter, more reserved, her gaze often drifting off into the distance, lost in some private, painful reverie. Charles, too, was different. He was more awkward, more nervous, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a twitchy unease. It was understandable, of course. Who could blame them? Grief had reshaped them, carved deep lines of sorrow into their faces, leaving them irrevocably altered. And then, just last week, the unsettling quiet shattered. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because trash day is Tuesday. I was wrestling our overflowing garbage bin to the curb when Charles appeared at the edge of our driveway. He looked different. Not just the usual quiet sadness, but something more agitated, more urgent. "Hey, Tom," he said, his voice strained, almost too casual. "Morning." "Morning, Charles," I replied, straightening up, wiping sweat from my brow with the back of my hand. "Rough week for trash, huh?" I tried to inject some levity, some normal neighborly banter, but it fell flat. Charles didn't smile. He just shifted his weight, his eyes darting around, avoiding direct contact with mine. "Listen, Tom," he began again, still with that too casual tone. "I was wondering, could I borrow a shovel? Just for a little backyard work." A shovel. It seemed like such a mundane request, so ordinary, that it momentarily calmed the subtle disquiet I felt. "Sure, Charles, no problem. Need a good shovel for backyard work," I joked, trying again to lighten the atmosphere. Without hesitation, I turned and headed towards the garage. We had 2 shovels, a standard, slightly rusty one we used for everyday gardening, and my prized possession, a gleaming, heavy-duty spade with a polished wooden handle, a gift from my father. No question which one Charles would get. I retrieved the good shovel, its weight familiar and comforting in my hands. I walked back to Charles, who was still standing at the edge of the driveway, fidgeting with his car keys. "Here you go, Charles," I said, handing him the shovel, handle first. "My best one. Get the job done right." He took the shovel, his fingers brushing mine for a fleeting second. "Thanks, Tom," he mumbled, his gaze still averted. "Really appreciate it. Just some, backyard work. I'll get it back to you by tomorrow, okay?" "No rush, Charles, no rush at all," I assured him. "Just let me know if you need anything else." He gave a curt nod, a half-hearted wave, and then turned abruptly and disappeared into his backyard, vanishing behind the tall wooden fence that separated our properties. I watched him go, a strange little seed of unease beginning to sprout in my mind. Backyard work? At 10 in the morning on a Tuesday? And why the secrecy, the averted gaze? It was probably nothing, just Charles being Charles, still grappling with his grief, still a little off. But the seed had been planted. I went back inside, the mundane rhythm of my day resuming. Lunch, emails, a quick check of the news. But the image of Charles, borrowing my shovel with that strange, hurried demeanor, kept flickering at the edge of my consciousness. Restlessness grew. By mid-afternoon, I found myself drifting upstairs, drawn by an inexplicable pull to the upstairs window that overlooked Charles's backyard. It was a second-floor window in our spare bedroom, angled just right to give a clear view over the fence. I rarely used this room, rarely looked out this window. But today, something compelled me. I peered out cautiously, half expecting to see nothing, to dismiss my growing unease as simple neighborly concern. But Charles was there, and he was digging. Not just a small hole for planting flowers or shrubs. This was a serious excavation. He was in the far corner of his yard, near the back fence, where a patch of overgrown shrubs usually hid a neglected corner. He was hacking away at the earth with my shovel, dirt flying in clods around him, the metallic scrape of metal against soil echoing faintly across the yards. He was struggling, too. Charles was a stocky man, but not particularly strong. At 56, digging a hole this size was clearly taking its toll. He'd pause frequently, leaning on the shovel handle, breathing heavily, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm. A sudden wave of neighborly instinct washed over me. He looked like he could use a hand. And besides, maybe helping him would ease this growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. I grabbed our second, less impressive shovel from the garage and headed towards the gate that connected our yards. "Charles," I called out as I stepped into his backyard, the shovel held casually at my side. "Hey, Charles, need a hand with that?" He froze. The shovel in his hand clattered to the ground, the sudden noise sharp in the quiet afternoon. He whirled around, his eyes wide, startled, almost panicked. He stared at me, his chest heaving, his face flushed and slick with sweat. "Tom," he said, his voice too loud, too strained. What are you doing here?" "Just thought you could use some help," I said, gesturing with my shovel. "Looks like a big job. 2 shovels are better than 1, right?" I tried to smile, to keep it light, friendly, but his reaction was anything but friendly. He hurried towards me, his movements jerky, almost frantic. No, it's okay," he insisted, waving his hands dismissively. I got it. Really. Please, just leave, Tom. It's fine." His abruptness, his almost aggressive dismissal, caught me off guard. "What's wrong, Charles?" I asked, my easygoing demeanor fading. replaced by a growing sense of bewilderment. "It's no big deal, just lending a hand." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, urgent whisper. "Tom, listen to me. I appreciate it, but I don't want you here. I will not allow you to use that shovel in my backyard." He pointed a trembling finger towards the gate, his eyes flashing with an intensity that bordered on hostility. "Please, just go. Now." I was stunned, taken aback by the sheer force of his reaction, the unexpected anger in his eyes. It was as if I had violated some unspoken boundary, crossed a line I hadn't even known existed. He was practically ordering me out of his yard, treating me like an unwelcome intruder. Without another word, my offer of help frozen on my lips, I turned and walked away. I retreated back through the gate, back into my own yard, the weight of his bizarre behavior settling heavily upon me. What in God's name was going on? Back upstairs, I couldn't resist. The window called to me again, that same unsettling pull. I found myself back in the spare bedroom, peering out at Charles's backyard, my curiosity now laced with a darker, more ominous feeling. He had resumed digging, his movements now more frantic, more desperate. He was throwing shovelful after shovelful of dirt out of the hole, the pile of earth growing steadily larger beside it. He worked for at least another half hour, the rhythmic scrape of the shovel a soundtrack to my growing unease. Finally, he stopped. He straightened up, his back aching. I imagined and surveyed his work. The hole was deep, surprisingly deep, a dark, gaping maw in the earth. Then, he did something that chilled me to the bone. He started looking around, not just casually glancing, but actively scanning his surroundings. He looked up at the neighboring houses, his gaze lingering on our windows, as if checking, verifying that no one was watching him. He was paranoid, jumpy, like a man with something to hide. My breath caught in my throat. He was looking right at our house. Panic flared. Before I could react, before I could duck back from the window, his eyes locked onto mine. He had seen me. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Our gazes held for a long, agonizing moment, across the distance of our yards, across the invisible barrier of the fence. His eyes were wide, startled, but also accusatory. It was as if he knew I was spying on him, as if he had expected me to be watching. Then, with a jolt, reality snapped back. I broke eye contact, forcing myself to move, to act casual. I slowly turned away from the window, pretending to be uninterested, as if I had just happened to glance out for a moment, nothing more. I walked deliberately away from the window, out of the spare bedroom, trying to appear nonchalant, my heart pounding against my ribs. He was up to something. There was no doubt in my mind now. Charles was hiding something, something big, something that made him act secretive, paranoid, and frankly, terrified of being discovered. And I, by innocently offering to help, had stumbled too close to his secret. The rest of the afternoon crawled by, each minute stretching into an eternity. I tried to distract myself, to focus on work, on dinner, on anything to push the image of Charles digging that hole out of my mind. But it was no use. It was like a persistent itch, a nagging question that wouldn't leave me alone. I continued to glance out the windows, every so often, drawn back to Charles's backyard by an invisible thread of morbid curiosity. But he wasn't digging anymore. The hole remained, a dark, gaping wound in the earth, but Charles was nowhere to be seen. I figured he knew I was watching now. He'd wait. He'd wait until dark. And I was exactly right. Darkness descended, slowly, relentlessly, shrouding our street in a cloak of shadows. Sarah and I ate a quiet dinner, the conversation strained, punctuated by long silences. I couldn't bring myself to tell her about Charles's strange behavior. Not yet. I needed to understand it myself first, needed to figure out what was really going on before I burdened her with my growing unease. We went to bed early, or at least, we pretended to. I lay beside Sarah, feigning sleep, my mind racing, my senses on high alert. The house was silent, the only sounds the gentle rhythm of Sarah's breathing and the distant hum of traffic. Then, at 1:30 in the morning, it started. A faint, rhythmic scraping sound, barely audible at first, filtering through the closed windows. SHHH gate clunk. SHHH gate clunk. The sound of a shovel hitting dirt. My heart leaped into my throat. I sat bolt upright in bed, instantly awake, instantly alert. I held my breath, listening intently. SHHH gate clunk. SHHH gate clunk. There was no mistaking it. Charles was back in his backyard, and he was digging again. It was too dark to see anything from our bedroom window now, the backyard swallowed by the inky blackness of night. I knew I had to see, had to know. I slipped silently out of bed, careful not to wake Sarah. My movements slow, deliberate, stealthy. I crept to the window, straining my eyes, but the darkness was impenetrable. I needed a better vantage point. I tiptoed out of the bedroom, down the hallway, and towards the back stairs, the ones that led to the mudroom and the back door. Downstairs, the house was even darker, the silence heavier, broken only by the faint, persistent SHHHK clunk from outside. I moved like a shadow, through the living room, the dining room, until I reached the mudroom. The back door, thankfully, wasn't locked. I eased it open, inch by agonizing inch, the hinges groaning in protest, each tiny creak feeling like a gunshot in the stillness of the night. I slipped outside, into the cool, crisp air, the sounds of the night enveloping me. Crickets chirping, a distant owl hooting, and the unmistakable SHHHK clunk from Charles's backyard. Our yards were separated by a tall wooden fence, designed for privacy, ironically. I moved along the fence line, my footsteps muffled by the damp grass, until I reached the section that bordered Charles's property. I peered cautiously over the top of the fence, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath held tight in my lungs. And there he was, Charles, in his backyard, digging. The moonlight, surprisingly bright, cast long, distorted shadows across his yard, illuminating him in stark relief. He was silhouetted against the pale light, a hunched figure laboring in the darkness, the shovel flashing silver as it caught the moonlight with each downward thrust. I watched him for a long, breathless moment, my mind reeling, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. He was digging furiously now, faster, more frantically than he had during the day. He was working as if possessed, driven by some unseen urgency, some desperate need to finish his task before dawn. Then, he stopped again. He straightened up, his back groaning. I could almost hear it from across the fence. He leaned on the shovel, catching his breath, and then, he turned and walked towards his house, disappearing into the shadows of his back porch. He was gone. My chance. Hesitation warred with an irresistible, almost primal urge to know. What was he digging? What was he hiding? The garbage bag, the way he reacted to me, the nighttime digging. It all pointed to something deeply, disturbingly wrong. I looked at his back door, a rectangle of dim light spilling out into the darkness. Then, back at the hole, a dark, gaping wound in the moonlit earth. 3 times, I looked back and forth, my mind a battlefield of conflicting impulses. Should I? Could I? Finally, the need to know overwhelmed my caution. Adrenaline surging, I scrambled over the fence, landing silently in Charles's backyard, the shovel still lying discarded near the hole. My heart hammered against my ribs, each beat echoing in the stillness of the night. I approached the hole cautiously, my senses on high alert, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig amplified in the silence. The hole was even deeper than it had looked from the window, a dark abyss descending into the earth. And then, I saw it. At the bottom of the hole, partially buried in the loose dirt, illuminated by the pale moonlight, a small piece of black plastic. A black garbage bag, just a corner of it, protruding from the dirt, but unmistakable. My breath hitched. A black garbage bag, buried in a hole, dug in the dead of night, hidden from prying eyes. What was inside it? What could Charles be hiding in a black garbage bag, buried in his backyard? The unthinkable thought, the one I had been subconsciously suppressing, the one that had been growing, festering in the back of my mind since Charles borrowed my shovel, finally surfaced, cold and terrifyingly clear. Michael, could it be? No, impossible. Too grotesque, too horrific to even contemplate. But the missing son, the years of unanswered questions, Charles's strange behavior, the secrecy, the nighttime digging, the black garbage bag, it all coalesced into a single, horrifying possibility. Terror, raw and visceral, gripped me. I stared at the black plastic peeking out of the dirt, my blood running cold, my mind racing, conjuring up images I didn't want to see, couldn't unsee. Just as the panic began to overwhelm me, a sound. A faint creak of a door hinge. Charles. He was coming back. Instinct took over. Terror propelled me. I turned and ran, scrambling back towards the fence, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I leaped, clearing the fence in a single, frantic bound, landing heavily in my own yard. My lungs burning, my legs trembling. I didn't stop running. I fled back to our house, fumbling with the back door, bursting inside, slamming it shut, bolting it, locking it, every nerve in my body screaming danger, escape, survival. I didn't stop until I was back in our bedroom, heart hammering, breath ragged, sweat cold on my skin. I collapsed onto the bed, Sarah stirring beside me, murmuring in her sleep. I lay there, gasping for air, listening, waiting, every muscle in my body tense, expecting Charles to burst through the door, to confront me, to what? I didn't even want to think about it. But he didn't come. Silence descended again, broken only by my own frantic breathing. Slowly, gradually, the adrenaline began to recede, replaced by a bone-deep chill, a lingering dread that settled in my stomach like a stone. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring into the darkness, replaying the night's events in my mind, the images of Charles digging, the hole, the black garbage bag, Michael's missing face, all swirling together into a nightmarish tableau. Finally, exhaustion claimed me. I drifted into a fitful, uneasy sleep, haunted by fragmented dreams of shovels, black plastic, and accusing eyes. The next morning, the first thing I did, even before coffee, before brushing my teeth, was to look out the window. Back at Charles's yard, the hole was gone, completely patched up, covered with fresh dirt, smoothed over, almost as if it had never been there, except for the slightly disturbed earth and the lingering sense of wrongness that hung in the air. There was no trace of the excavation from the night before. And then I noticed something else. Charles's SUV. It was parked in the street now, instead of its usual spot in the driveway, parked facing away from the house, as if ready for a quick getaway. I stared at the patched-up earth, at the SUV parked on the street, and a new wave of cold dread washed over me. I didn't know what had happened throughout the rest of that night, after I had fled back to our house. But the patched hole, the parked SUV, the black garbage bag, it all pointed to one terrifying conclusion. Charles had dug up that hole to remove whatever he had previously buried down there. And then he had driven it somewhere else, to dump it, to get rid of it. And the chilling possibility, the horrifying implication, echoed in my mind, louder and louder, with each passing moment. Had that black garbage bag contained Michael? Speculation, I know. Call me crazy if you want. I haven't told anyone, not even Sarah. How could I? What would I say? Honey, I think our neighbor might have buried his missing son in his backyard, dug him up in the middle of the night, and driven off to dump the body somewhere else. It sounded insane, paranoid, unbelievable. And yet, the unease persisted, the dread lingered, the feeling that something terrible, something unspeakable, had happened right next door. Charles never gave me back my shovel. Not that I expected him to, and certainly not that I would ever ask him for it. In fact, he's been avoiding me ever since. He doesn't wave across the lawn anymore. He doesn't make eye contact. If he sees me outside, he ducks back into his house, or busies himself in the far corner of his yard, pretending I'm not there. And then, something else happened. Something that amplified the unease, that solidified my fear, that turned suspicion into something close to certainty. Something disturbing. Yesterday, I was in the living room, reading, trying to distract myself from the ever-present knot of anxiety in my stomach. Just by chance, I glanced out the window, across at Charles's house, and I saw him. He was standing at one of his windows, looking directly into mine. It wasn't a casual glance, not a neighborly wave. He was standing perfectly still, his face pale, his eyes fixed, staring intently, watching our house, watching me. The moment our eyes met, his reaction was instantaneous. He didn't just turn away. He recoiled. He practically jumped back from the window, his movements jerky, almost violent. And then, with a sharp, decisive snap, he yanked the blinds shut, cutting off the view, plunging his living room into darkness. Blinds shut, in the middle of the day, like he was hiding, like he didn't want to be seen, like he was afraid of being watched. I stood frozen, staring at his closed blinds, my heart pounding in my chest, a cold wave of terror washing over me. He was watching me. He knew I was watching him. He knew I suspected something. And now I was afraid, not just uneasy, not just suspicious, terrified, truly, deeply terrified, of Charles, of what he might have done, of what he might do if he knew how much I knew, how much I suspected. I have no idea what to do. None. Call the police? Tell them what I saw, what I suspect. But it's all circumstantial. No proof. Just gut feelings, unsettling observations, a borrowed shovel, a black garbage bag, a patched hole in the ground. They think I was crazy, paranoid, a busybody neighbor with an overactive imagination. And what if I'm wrong? What if it's all just a terrible misunderstanding? What if I accuse Charles of something so horrific, so unspeakable, and I'm completely wrong? The damage would be irreparable. Our already strained neighborly relations would be shattered beyond repair. And I'd be labeled as the crazy neighbor, the one who makes unfounded accusations, the one to be avoided. But what if I'm right? What if Michael really was buried in that backyard? What if Charles is a murderer? And what if he knows I suspect him? What if I've put myself and Sarah in danger? I'm trapped, caught in a web of fear and uncertainty, paralyzed by doubt, haunted by suspicion. I don't know what to do. I honestly, truly don't know what to do. So, that's where I am. Stuck, terrified, watching my neighbor's house, watching his closed blinds, wondering what secrets they hide, wondering what darkness lurks beneath the surface of our quiet suburban street. And the worst part is, the absolute worst, is the feeling that this is just the beginning, that this unease, this fear, this suspicion is only going to grow, to fester, to consume me, until something breaks, until something happens. And I'm not sure, not at all sure, that I want to be around when it does. Wow, that story, it really gets under your skin, doesn't it? The slow burn of suspicion, the creeping dread, the feeling of being trapped in a nightmare right in your own backyard. It's the kind of story that makes you look at your own neighbors a little differently, makes you wonder about the secrets hidden behind closed doors in every seemingly normal neighborhood. What would you do in Tom's situation? Would you go to the police? Would you confront Charles? Or would you try to ignore it, to bury your head in the sand and hope it all just goes away? Let me know in the comments below. I'm really curious to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this story and want to find out what happens next, because trust me, this is just the tip of the iceberg, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And definitely leave a comment if you want to see part 2. Your support will help me bring you more chilling stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and sleep tight, if you can.